to welcome you to the 8th floor, and I would like to thank our generous hosts, Shelley and Donald Rubin, who are providing the venue, and the staff here at the 8th floor, who is always exceptional. As you may know, A Blade of Grass, the sponsoring organization, is a funding nonprofit that's dedicated to nurturing socially engaged artists and its programs director. We fund artists and collectives that are working directly with communities in ways that are relevant to everyday life at an ambitious scale to enact social change. We also create programs and web content that explore the challenges and opportunities of socially engaged art practice. Tonight's discussion is part of our Aesthetics of Doing discussion series, which brings together artists, scholars, administrators, and other members of the art community for conversations that critically address socially engaged art as it is practiced and defined. We're very grateful that this programming is supported in part by public funds from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council. For tonight's conversation, we'd like to welcome artist Steve Kurtz, 2014 ABOC Fellow Jan Munn, and Becca Economopoulos and Jason Jones from Not an Alternative for a conversation exploring how artists and collectives can strategically embed themselves within powerful organizations and affect change from the inside. I'd like to turn it over to Deborah Fisher, our illustrious executive director, who has agreed to moderate this evening's panel. So take it away, Deborah.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And thanks everybody for being here, and thank you, wonderful panelists. I'm just going to quickly read bios, and then we can get started with brief presentations. Steve Kurtz is a founding member of the internationally acclaimed art and theory group Critical Art Ensemble, a collective of tactical media practitioners who focus on the exploration of intersections between art, critical theory, technology, and political activism. The collective has performed and produced a wide variety of projects for an international audience at diverse venues ranging from the street to the museum to the internet. Jan Munn is an artist who explores the generative principles of how complex systems such as botany and fungi, economies, and social networks function, and the effects of interactions between different entities, whether cultures, plants, or people. As the artist in residence of the Newtown Creek Alliance, she has previously partnered with ExxonMobil, one of the stakeholders conducting the cleanup of the Greenpoint oil spill, to create the Fairy Rings, a micro-remediation-inspired art installation. And Jason and Becca of Not an Alternative. Not an Alternative is an arts collective and nonprofit with a mission to affect popular understandings of events, symbols, institutions, and history. Their most recent and ongoing project, and project that has been supported by A Blade of Grass, thank you guys, is the Natural History Museum, a new museum that offers exhibitions, expeditions, educational workshops, and public programming. Unlike traditional natural history museums, it makes a point to highlight these socio-political forces that shape nature, including those affecting the atmospheric climate on Earth, as well as the political and funding climate within museums of science and natural history. Welcome, panelists. Steve, you want to start with a brief presentation?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. Okay. So there's a temporary monument to North American energy security, which is a project that we did for Nuit Blanche in Toronto. And so we had to deal in this particular case, and why I'm using it for sleeping with the enemy, because all of our enemies were there. Right? Government, corporations. I mean, it's pretty much, you put it together, it's that entire global capitalist network that we're mostly, unfortunately, complicit with on a daily basis. But now and again, we get the opportunity to perhaps talk back, if not act back. So the discussion of what do you do in these cases? And where we were commissioned was to do it in the town hall square, which seemed to us to be a problem to begin with, because, right, town hall squares are these awful alibis for democracy and are supposed to actually be the space where democracy works and is in action each day. And of course, squares are never used that way. In fact, they're usually used for the exact opposite purpose 99% of the time. Occasionally, maybe a rally or something will show up. But mostly, there's no emergent discourse from which policy shall be made. It doesn't really happen. So we thought, let's actually use this space as a place of dialogue. So that's going to make trouble number one. And then it was, well, what issue do we pick? And for those of you following the news in Canada, one of the more controversial subjects is the extraction industry. So it seemed pretty much like a no-brainer what one to pick. It's like, let's have the pros and cons of the extraction system, and we'll let them talk it out in this public place. Now, as soon as we do that, we have a lot of problems. If it's clear that we're going to say negative things about this incredibly powerful lobbying group. One, we have the lobbying group. Two, we have the political officials that we have to deal with that have to put an okay on anything that's going to happen in the square. And since a lot of this funding comes from the city, and then we have the third funders, the extraction industry themselves, who they're directly involved, and of course a number of banks, most notably Scotiabank, that has ties to the extraction industry. So we have this array of forces, this kind of solid wall saying, oh, you know, we don't like this idea too much. It's not really, we would prefer if you picked a different topic. If you're going to come up here and do something in the town hall. But our position was, you know, we're in the square, and we should be able to do something controversial. That's what squares are for. Now, we are lucky, and this is kind of the first piece of advice, double agents, right? Is to find those people that are ambivalent about where they are working. And they're always there, whether they're in corporations or they're in government. And they can function as basically double agents for us. And we found a couple of those who were quite helpful, who really thought this was a good idea to do this monument and have this dialogue. And they really kind of worked the interior for us. So we could feed them information and they would say, well, here's how you need to spin this when we have the town hall meeting. Or here's how you need to spin this when we meet with the board that's funding the festival. They were really good at kind of setting us up and putting things into a language which those who kind of wanted to do the censorship would respond to in a more positive way. So just to show you very quickly what we did, please notice how clean the water is. We started with this monument where we put up the tanks and we made up a company, Can American Energy. This is something that Beck was going to speak about, how you speak through these kind of false agencies by appropriating their form of organization. And we copied their video style as close as we could to how they try to mesh the cleanliness of extraction with functions perfectly in nature, never a problem. Okay, we go to the next. And we had our own public relations vice president. She's actually an actress that we hired, but she was perfect for the job. She would go around and go to all the openings, and it would be hilarious because she would come at the end with all of these cards to say, look at all these faces that want me to donate money to them. Anyway, because they thought she was a real public relations program. So onward we went, next slide. There's a problem. About a few hours into the night, as people are about to pull their hair out saying, how can this industry propaganda be part of this arts festival? It starts going in a different direction. And we go to the next slide. And this is what we thought was the best argument we could make for the ecological side, for the green side, is look what can happen to have an oil spill in your fountain. And to bring it home, to bring it right in to the city center. Now, counter to that, what Andy, our VP, was saying, she was saying, if you want to end the war in Iraq, if you want to stop permanent occupation of the Middle East, then we have to do extraction at home. Right? We tried to give them like a fairly reasonable argument, because people aren't going to stop using oil. And as long as that is the case, take your choice. You can have permanent war, or you can have us. And it is, in a way, the kind of gun to the head that we have right now. And so to try and put that side out with the positive side, and then also to make the green argument, if you go to the next slide, you can see how black the water turned. And go to the next one, I think is another. Oh, we had some taggers come on and skull up and give their free speech of what they thought of this particular monument. So, these are the kind of things we end up working with quite a bit. How do you deal with government and corporate agency, and how do you find the language in which you talk to them so they get themselves too far down the road to back out, right? That's where you have to move them. How far can you move them to the space that they're too invested, both publicly and financially, but at the same time, give them as little as possible. Give them as little whitewash, greenwash, and use of your name to say, we're a democratic institution. Because we made them promise they could only use this as Can American Energy. They couldn't use Critical Art Ensemble until after the project was over. So they really didn't like that, but that's another discussion. I think I'm about out of time. Thanks.
Hi, so I'm with Not an Alternative, and so are a couple people there, Josh and Mom, Jason. So yeah, this idea of strategic embedding is one that has informed our practice since day one. I think it goes back to the choice of the name Not an Alternative, right? Where we think about any subjectivity, any entity as being inherently split and being defined as much by that which it excludes as its positive attributes, right? And that in inhabiting that space of exclusion or refusal, we can kind of force into the equation or the definition of that subjectivity, like bring to light a contradiction and sort of occupy that gap. At the level of the institution and occupying institutions, which has been a part of our practice over the last decade, we're very interested in that sort of gap or contradiction between the ideals of the institution and its practice. And also recognize institutions as not monolithic, right? And that idea for us, the name Not an Alternative came from a Margaret Thatcher quote. She was kind of our mascot or our muse, and she said, there is no alternative to capitalism. And so it's sort of inhabiting that no alternative as a positive constitution. That said, I think our point of departure for this conversation is understanding that we are all sleeping with the enemy every day, all day long, to borrow from Steve. And there's no escape from capitalism. You can try to, tune out, drop out, unplug, but maybe you don't have a Facebook profile, but there's a good chance that somebody's uploaded a photo with you in it. Maybe you're totally off the grid and you ride your bike everywhere and have a backyard garden or, keep chickens, but I'm a walking, talking advertisement for gentrification in North Brooklyn, whether I want to be or not, right? My identity is subsumed into ad campaigns that propel this. And that's true, you don't have to be in Williamsburg. It's true wherever you are. And so now what? What do you do with that? And is it possible to occupy or strategically embed in a way that that affects some sort of transformation? We think about the phrase within and against. In talking about institutions, we also question who can speak on behalf of an institution. Is it just its employees, people who get a paycheck from it? Is it its docents or volunteers if you're talking about a natural history museum? And can institutions be hijacked by anyone who convincingly performs in their name? So for us, with our most recent work in the Natural History Museum, we've created a real museum. It's registered with the American Alliance of Museums. But we are borrowing the aesthetic vocabulary and sort of authoritative language of the generic Natural History Museum in order to get into the museum sector and transform it from within. Our work historically has been very informed by the practice of institutional critique as embodied in the practice of artists like Hans Hake and Fred Wilson and Andrea Fraser and others. And those, I think, are artists who are engaging with institutions, with museums in particular, because they believe in them at some level. And I think my generation and millennials certainly are very disillusioned with institutions because they've failed us in so many ways and across so many sectors, right? They've been hollowed out by neoliberal budget cuts. They're being privatized, right? They're tugged away from the public interest towards the private interest. There's like an epidemic of corporate sponsorships and naming within our institution, our cultural institutions in particular. And it was just this week, just a couple days ago, that some internal documents got FOIA'd and released in the UK that showed that Shell Oil, a corporate sponsor of the London Science Museum, did in fact use their sponsorship of the climate gallery, of their climate exhibitions, to attempt to influence programming. Something like 595 pages of emails where it wasn't just a one-time thing, it was a systemic practice. Museum representatives, kind of pushed back on it, but did admit or confirm that it's not unusual for sponsors to make requests. Right? And so for us, we were very inspired. Well, one, recognized that institutional critique as a practice maybe it had sort of lost its teeth insofar as you have these institutional artists that are invited into the institution to critique, reveal power dynamics and structures and so on, and then they go away and that's the end of the day, right? It's sort of a little controversial, but then absorbed as democratic discourse. And so there is a sort of iteration upon that form, we felt, in the work of our peers in the UK, Liberate Tate. So that's a group that was using the vocabulary of the Tate Modern and the Tate Museums in order to critique the Tate's BP sponsorship in the aftermath of the BP Horizon oil spill. And they got a lot of traction in the media around the world. And for us, what was really interesting about the work that they were doing, many interventions and performances in the vernacular of activism, I would call them actions, that were not so easily absorbed by the institution and were not sanctioned, right? It was like an unauthorized adoption of the vocabulary performing in the institution's name. And that it was married to a pressure campaign from the exterior. So it was this sort of inside-outside strategy that we found to be very interesting and ultimately mirrored so many successful social change campaigns and activities or moments in history that had both inside and outside strategies. I'll just close with offering a few examples of the Natural History Museum, where what we were especially interested in doing was creating space for champions on the inside of these institutions to make change, at the same time that we were building a counter-institution that could potentially represent counter-power. So that's a term we think a lot about, is the relationship between social movements, between institutions as counter-power infrastructure. And how do we develop that and nurture it? And maybe I'll get into some examples, more specific examples of the project, but I'll pass the mic to you.
I'm going to just in European folklore, it was believed that the gathering and dancing of fairies and elves created fairy rings, a circular discoloration of growth of mushrooms on the grass lawn. This belief transformed these spaces from reality into fantasy. Today, as knowledge changes and we know fairy rings are a natural phenomenon created by fungi, I use fairy rings in my work as potential transformative spaces. Working with microremediation strategies, which is the use of fungi to degrade or remove toxins from the environment, drawn from the book, Mycelium Running, How Mushrooms Can Save the World, written by mycologist Paul Stamets. Okay. The fairy rings at ExxonMobil Greenpoint Petroleum Remediation Project is an interface for a large corporation, a community group, and a Superfund site to navigate using art and science to imagine the future by working together to find a solution to a common goal to clean up Newtown Creek, one of the most contaminated waterways in the country, located here in New York City. As artists and residents of Newtown Creek Alliance, a community-based organization dedicated to restoring, revealing, and revitalizing Newtown Creek, in 2013, ExxonMobil invited me to install a land version of the fairy rings at the site where the second largest oil spill in the country occurred. The installation is located on Newtown Creek, where over 140 years of operation by the oil and gas industries in Greenpoint went undetected until 1978. For the community, this was especially significant since the site has always been off limits. We were the first outside group invited into the site to work on a project. At the site with the monitoring wells, which you see here on the white poles, they detect the progress of the remediation process that ExxonMobil is conducting. As this is the ground zero of the spill, these are also the last wells to indicate if the cleanup has been completed. This is an installation plan of the fairy rings and the maze around the monitoring wells. This is a view of the still existing BP oil tanks next door to the site. This is my project partner, Jason Sinopoli, and Mitch Waxman, whom you don't see because he photographed and documented the entire process. This is our site foreman from ExxonMobil, Vito, who helped us throughout the project of 4 months. And our main contact, Kevin at ExxonMobil, helping us install the work. As part of the project, a copy of the book, Mycelium Running, was strategically placed in the break room to share with the on-site environmental engineers who occupy the entire space. We found that many were taking the book home to read on their spare time, which was what we had hoped for. This is a photograph of the community workday at Gail Lopez's Smiling Hogshead Ranch Farm in Long Island City, and it gave an opportunity for the community to work on the project, which was otherwise off limits to the general public. As we spent the summer working to care for the installation, the mushroom mycelium grew, as did our relationship with the environmental engineers on the site. One day when Mitch, our photographer, couldn't make it to the site, ExxonMobil staff helped take photographs of the project through their security cameras. At the end of the project, the environmental engineers self-organized for us to do a presentation, calling into their headquarters and give a tour of the installation. Fungi also has an uncanny ability to jumpstart an ecological system, and the hope is through this project we hope to jumpstart a better relationship and communicate with folks at Exxon in the community. This led to the next project, next iteration, called the Greenpoint, named after the previous site, which was the Greenpoint Petroleum Remediation Project. Our project is called the Greenpoint Bioremediation Project. It's an interface for the community partnership to develop and innovate bioremediation practices in Greenpoint, Brooklyn. As a creative cleanup initiative, the Greenpoint Bioremediation Project aims to bring accessible remediation strategies to local residents by harnessing processes that occur naturally in the environment to target historical contaminants and recondition surface soil using beneficial microbes, compost, and microremediation. In order to make this feasible, we have been conducting research at the Urban Soil Institute at Brooklyn College to test the efficacy of bioremediation practices through lab experiments. These are the sites that we've been testing soil from, Exxon, this is Apollo Street end on the Brooklyn side of Newtown Creek. This is Plank Road on the Queens side of Newtown Creek. This is New York City Department of Environmental Protection bioswale, which is used to capture stormwater runoff, and some mycelium growing in the lab, and some process images from the research experiment. As the mycelium and mushrooms were growing in the contaminated soil, we noticed that a lot of other species were also growing, and that the bacteria and fungi were taking over the mycelium. DNA, we did DNA sequencing and the data throughout the experiment to track the changes between the population of the microorganisms. This allowed us to better understand the relationships that were being created between the different microorganisms and the inoculated mycelium that we added to the soil. So these are some data sets of the different metagenomic communities. This is our hydrocarbon test results for diesel, indicating that the experiment wasn't as effective in remediating diesel as we had hoped, leading to introducing a new strain of mushrooms, the garden giant, into the research. Another method that we're using is to train the mycelium by introducing the contaminated soil during cultivation. This is our research group at Brooklyn College, missing a lot of people, but during our lab coat making event, preparing for a public event that we did recently. Oops. And this is our group sharing research and offering free soil testing to the public this past weekend. And through the work, with Brooklyn College, we've been beginning to get a better understanding of the soils that we live in and that we live to remediate. So that's the project. Thank you.
Thanks, all of you. I want to start with just this idea that all three of you are working with people within these institutions, and you're working with people in very different ways. Can we focus, so Steve, you started with kind of a great quote. We want to get them too far down the road to back out. Yes. Okay, whereas like Jan, I think you're definitely on the other end of the continuum, right? Like you're really working in a very collaborative way. And a great quote that came out of the conversation we had was like, Kevin from ExxonMobil became Kevin from New Orleans, right? So can we talk a little bit about how relationships matter in this work?
Well, we've always approached what we do as straight up negotiation, to take it, kind of hardball business style. They know what we're there for, obviously, to try and get some kind of sponsorship for a project they don't really want to do. And we know why they've come to the table, because they want to use us as some kind of alibi for democracy, or some kind of greenwash, or some kind of whitewash. We know why they're sitting at the table with us. So now it's a matter of who has the better negotiating skills. And we've lost some and we've won some. And and so that's how we're looking at it. But if we can get insider help, as I mentioned, and anything to kind of get the edge, it's really playing the predatory game. And of course, there's this tremendous rhetorical dimension. Like currently, we're working on a project in London. We have to go to all these town hall meetings and city councils and try and get them to do this project in which we're doing another temporary monument to all that has been dispossessed, destroyed, evicted, and made extinct in the Thames estuary due to the superport, which is now built and open. There's nothing we can really do about it. What kind of you can't go in and say that, but that's what we're doing. We talk about maritime heritage until we get them to, and now they're too far down the road and they can't get back, right? So that's kind of how it works, is how do you lead the negotiation, how do you sustain it, keep them in it, until hopefully, you know, you can come out the better.
So you're tricking people.
Yeah, which is what they're trying to do to us. That's what we're doing. That's the
Yeah.
dance we're doing.
Other thoughts? You are not tricking people. You're not tricking people.
No, but we're not, when we talk about strategic embedding, you know, for us it's because we believe that there's something worth recuperating or fighting for within the institution or the entity in which we're embedding. You know, you're playing ball with the fossil fuel industry, like we don't. You know, we're playing ball with museums of science and natural history, so it's kind of a different thing. And
with that.
but you know, there I don't really talk about our work, what we're doing, but I mean, you know, some examples like this project never would have taken off if we hadn't identified allies in the upper echelons of the museum sector. You know, so the Center for the Future of Museums is a project of the American Alliance of Museums, and the executive director, when we first went public with this project, you know, was super enthusiastic, and it was thanks to her that we had the single largest exhibitor spot in the world's largest museum convention last month by a factor of 9. And it was right next to the Smithsonian and the American Museum of Natural History, who have David Koch on their board of Koch Industries, one of the probably the world's biggest funder of the climate denial machine. And we took advantage of that opportunity to mount an exhibition using museum aesthetics that talked about fossil fuel industry greenwashing in science museums, and specifically recreated installations from the American Museum of Natural History and the Smithsonian, but inserted previously excluded socio-political context, i.e. the role of David Koch, their board member and biggest sponsor. And you know, and she also featured us in their annual publication Trends Watch. And then while we were there, met a ton of museum professionals who, in particular, were at natural history museums affiliated with universities. So I think they're like a little more, they're sort of champions of academic freedom there, and a little more amenable to perhaps edgy content, but also starved for content, right? They can't afford blockbuster exhibits. So that was something that hadn't even occurred to us. But since we were on the convention floor in this like sort of trade show dynamic where everybody else was vendors, you know, they came to our exhibition thinking, oh, is this an exhibition you travel? Are you selling it? Can we bring it to our institution? We're like,
oh, that's
do you really want that?
Yeah.
And we're like, well, you know, maybe not this one, but sure, yeah, we'll give you a menu of options. We'll do an exhibition. We can do an exhibition on the attack on science, or on climate denialism, or on collective responses to climate change. So now we're in discussion with the Florida Natural History Museum, the Ohio Natural History Museum, the Kansas Natural History Museum, about bringing this content there, and then using it as a platform to activate local campaigns, and where students affiliated with the university have divestment, fossil fuel divestment campaigns and Uncoke My Campus chapters.
And are those natural history museums that you're talking with, are they finding that they have issues with people who are sitting on their boards or funding their museums specifically, or do you not know that?
Yeah, I mean, so many people have said, you know what, this purported firewall between board members or funders and our programming is like, you know, is bogus. Like it's come up so many times. So there's
with the people that you're contracting with.
Well, we're not there yet, right?
Okay,
But these are sort of, you know, initial conversations. So there's definitely like an appetite from these people who are like, we share the same values. They're working at natural history museums because they're passionate about natural history or science, or and thus we're sort of approaching this assuming that that we're on the same side, and that we can play this disruptor role to accelerate conversations that have been, and bring more urgency to conversations that have been happening behind closed doors, and bring them out into the public sphere.
So in some ways, you're almost acting like a consultant who comes into a corporation, you know, to be the person who makes you aware of a problem that you're having within your organization in some way. I
think that's true, though we're also keen to sort of hold to hold this line. There is a line in the sand, right?
Yeah.
We're not going to stop talking about David Koch. We're not going to stop pissing you off. Just, like.
Right.
So there's a choreography there.
Got it. And Jan, what's your take?
I sort of think about it on a much more personal level, that, I'm more apt to listen to people I care about. Like I'll probably, I'll probably listen to my family or friends or people that I trust. So what I work really hard to do in my work is to try and create those relationships where that can happen, so that even though we might be on opposing sides, that maybe we can find somewhere along that we can actually hear each other. So that that maybe it's possible to listen, and negotiate, from that point.
So it sounds like there are really different goals, based on these relationships from all of these projects, right? Like a shared space, or a complete disruption or a negotiation. Yeah.
I mean, I think about it in terms of an occupation rather than a negotiation.
Okay.
I mean, when we started this project, it started as a Koch campaign, and
right.
then we just thought, we could chain ourselves to the doors of the American Museum of Natural History, and it's not going to go anywhere. We could do a one-strike critique, and it's not going to go anywhere. We're going to be positioned on the outside, and this institution is so massive, and it's so supported by so many people. It's a great institution for so many reasons. Like, we're just going to be alienated. We're going to get pushed to the exterior. Everyone's going to be turned against us. So our question was, how can we think about the field, the political field out there, all of the actors, and cause as much? How can we align all these figures and institutions and basically to cause as much, to build as much power as possible, to create as much transformation or damage, if you'd like, as possible.
Well, is it transformation or is it damage? Can we stop there for a second?
It's both. So I talk about this in funding proposals to particular audiences as both a campaign and a counter-institution, or a campaign and a museum. It was very important to us to recruit and align ourselves with very prominent scientists, to have a base of folks that, and museum professionals. So we built an advisory board, and the former president and director of the Los Angeles County Natural History Museum and the Franklin Science Institute is on our board, and a deep collaborator, as well as a number, we teamed up with initially about 34 of the world's top scientists and several Nobel Laureates.
Can you talk about that campaign a little bit and go into that?
Sure, yeah. It was just a couple months ago. We teamed up with a few dozen of the world's top scientists and several Nobel laureates to release a letter calling on science and natural history museums to cut all ties to the fossil fuel industry. And then got more specific in a few places and saying what that means is kick climate deniers off your boards, cancel fossil fuel industry sponsorships, and divest your financial holdings from the fossil fuel industry. Just to try to lay a sort of broader framework for organizations that do run campaigns to gain more traction. So we released that, and it kind of took off beyond our wildest dreams. It was on the homepage of the New York Times and on NPR every hour and in every major outlet. I think, within a few days we had probably 150 media hits in different places. And then it was a conversation that sort of kept going and led to then the author of an op-ed in The Guardian about wanting to take it a step further and say, because the first line of defense for museums was, well, we don't do that. We're neutral.
Right. As
if neutrality were even a thing. And as if the time for neutrality hadn't long since passed, And that the neutrality that they speak of manifests as this unacknowledged on explicit bias, right? There's actually a bias and an ideology built into the programming that favors the status quo. And so we were calling on, but we're not the people to do it, right? So we teamed up with scientists to be the people to call on museums that communicate science to the public to take a stand to combat the fossil fuel lobby.
Yeah, and one of the ways in which you were able to do that was through this counter institution, right? Through speaking through the form of the institution itself. And Steve, you do this a lot too, but you guys do it in very different ways. Can you talk a little bit about how you do? Let's do a compare contrast.
Well, taking on the voices of the institutions.
Yeah.
Yeah, we do use that tactic, and it's been helpful to us, particularly when we were doing a lot of work with biotechnology. It was a great way to infiltrate places that we couldn't otherwise get to, particularly places where there would be some kind of conference or get together or display or expo or whatever, that we could make our way in there by pretending to be Gentera or pretending to be Biocom. And then once in there, you know, the sky's the limit. Then you get whatever you want to roll out. And because the thing that really helps
Can you just give a concrete example of something that you have rolled out that hit the sky as the limit?
The things that you
Yeah,
can
just
do
be concrete. Yeah, give a good example.
Well, one of the things that we did in this one big public park is we, this isn't as dangerous as it's going to sound, and that was the whole point of it, is we released transgenic bacteria into the ecosystem.
What does that mean?
Yeah, see, it sounds really bad. So when you tell people that you're in the middle of this park with the other little, you know, stalls and expo booths and such like, that we're about to release the bacteria. And the reason we did that was because when you want to talk to someone about transgenic products and GMOs, they don't really want to hear it. No one really, I mean, this audience would. But let me tell you, when you're just in the park, the 99% of the people you're going to meet who are just passing through, they're not attending a show or anything, they don't care. They do not want to hear about it. It's boring. And what has to be done is you have to show them they have an immediate stake in what you're talking about. And the way we could show them they have an immediate stake is by saying, okay, we're going to release some transgenic bacteria. And now, both the topic of bacteria and transgenics becomes really interesting, because they got to figure out, am I getting out of here or what? What is happening? Right? It's immediate. It's in there. You know, it's embodied now with them. So what we actually did is we took some harmless human gut E. coli, and we put in some DNA, some human DNA, not a gene, just some human DNA into it, which is basically meaningless. It's basically meaningless. So it's only in
this ability to use the word.
It's only in the technical kind of sense that we could call it transgenic. So it's two things, right? It's transgenics. People are afraid of that to begin with. And then two, bacteria. People are really afraid of that, right? Even though it's like, you know, you have to explain.
There's more bacteria than you in your body.
Yes, way more than yourselves. You know, we are bacterial ecosystems in and of itself.
Right.
You know, and it's the foundation of every ecosystem. We're ubiquitously exposed to it. And I'm not impugning anyone's hygiene or anything. It's just the case. But there's also, just in this country, right, a $4.5 billion disinfectant industry that likes us to think otherwise, right? You know, it's the old Purell, imagine a touchable world, right? It's so bad, we can't even touch anything. There's bacteria everywhere that's going to get you. And we're socialized to that from the time we're young, from parents, doctors. So people come in afraid of that, but with the authority of being Gentera in that time and making this and saying we were going to do it, it inspired conversations that were amazing, and people stayed. They got so interested and would then really work with the bacteria, and they would read all what we had online, and it became a completely different kind of situation. So once you're in the door, you know, you can do what could appear as very foolish things, but there's an authority of legitimacy that makes it okay.
there's legitimacy, and you guys are really using legitimacy as well. But I think that another thing that's happening is you're all managing complexity, right? Like so by taking on taking on this idea that we're going to be the museum, you're able to have a much more complex debate, right? Or talk about something that's invisible. Or Jan, you're talking about you're talking about a very, very complex system that you're trying to integrate, that has a social element and a corporate element.
And I actually believe that legitimacy is one of the keys.
Here, let's try to switch. Let's do that. Does that work better?
Does that work better? I think so. I'm just nervous. Okay. I think legitimacy is one of the things that that really does open a lot of doors, so whether if you did this as an art project and it was, you weren't Terra, people might not be as willing to listen to your transgenic project, or actually they might even be more scared.
It would be terrible. It would be terrible as an art project. Mm-hmm. It wouldn't work at all. I mean, for new social practices, I think, in how we distinguish ourselves from the avant-garde, is the avant-garde stays within its specialization and it tries to blow open the conventions of the specialization. Mm-hmm. Folks, like every person sitting right here, we blow out the frame of specialization, let people come to it and read the event the way they want to read the event. They can read it as art, they can read it as design, they can read it as science, they can read it as activism.
Mm-hmm. That's a great point.
And I was just thinking, that you employed a lot of scientists, and and that sort of helped open up the conversation. That gave the legitimacy that you could, if you were just alone and said, hey, these are the facts. I bet a lot of the Natural History Museum staff and people that work there and go there don't even know a lot of the things that are happening, behind the scenes and what you're unfolding and stuff like that. So it helps, I think, a lot of people sort of, whether we like it or not, it does that legitimacy of the scientist speaking or something opens up that space for people to listen, and they might, discover more about even where they are that they might not have known before. So it's an interesting thing that, whether we like it or not, that's the reality.
We've talked about how our aim is to model the museum of the future, and that we use a couple of strategies. One is biomimicry, in which we're using these very legitimizing aesthetics and pedagogical models and presentation forms in order to tell us sort of people's history of natural history, or amplify climate justice narratives or so on. And then two is sort of strategic embedding or parasitic embedding in a host institution. And part of that is like augmenting these sort of static displays of nature with dynamic socio-political context, either through interventions or tours or in existing natural history museums or augmented reality apps or so on. But this idea of modeling the museum of the future, I think that you're kind of doing something similar in your work in sort of modeling a practice of bioremediation and being taken seriously. Like you were costuming as well, and so there's like an acknowledgement of representation as being very important in gaining confidence or access to a particular sector. But from talking to you, I understand that these tactics of bioremediation, while plausibly possible, have not successfully scaled yet. Yet, you're sort of developing access points to gain buy-in from people who could scale it.
Well, yeah, and Jan, do you want to talk a little bit about how, because your project is not simply, what you're doing is you're creating a network, right? So it's not really just about you and Exxon, it's about the relationship between many, many different stakeholders. Can you talk a little bit about the network that you're creating?
I sort of think, one of the main things that I do, is actually not in the lab, but it's introductions. So it's to make sure that the people in the community meet each other and know about each other that might not otherwise. I'm still surprised that we're allowed into the labs at Brooklyn College, that we haven't been thrown out, you know?
Why? Did you release transgenic bacteria?
No, but yeah, but it's just one of those things where, you know, you just feel really grateful. Right? You're just like, why am I here? But it's yeah. So I think I forgot the question.
Well, so I was just making sure that everybody understood that you are really kind of creating a vast network. You've got like a legal angle on this. You've got who's going to install these things. You know, you're thinking about lots and lots and lots of different stakeholders.
Right. So, I mean, one of the questions that comes up is very often is that what happens when you find out that your backyard is heavily contaminated? Who's liable? How do you fix it? You know, what do you have to fix? And these are sort of things that we're trying to unfold and connect people so that this information becomes a bit more apparent, because it's pretty dense right now. I mean, you know, if you look at the contamination, it's not just the oil spill on Newtown Creek, it's all around the area. It's all, you know, I mean, Newtown Creek is littered with, you know, is one Superfund, but it's littered with 10 other Superfunds in addition to, that haven't been established yet, in addition to, you know, multiple brownfields. So it's, you know, if residents start building, you know, when they're affected by these corporations, who you know is responsible? What do you do when there's high lead or high PCBs or, you know, benzene in your backyard? You know, these are things that we're trying to uncover and provide information to see if there are ways to, you know, that people can be more empowered by, you know.
Yeah, that makes sense. So one of the most interesting things that came up in our discussion a couple of days ago was just, wait a minute, how are we doing on time, Joel? How much time do we have? Oh, perfect. One of the things that I really enjoyed talking a lot about was this idea of, like, you know, how specific is your political agenda? You know, how specific is your political agenda?
Well, mine's not very specific at all, and the reason for it is, and this is, you know, kind of one of these points of contrast, is we, in our group, Critical Art Ensemble, we only think about these things tactically. We don't think about anything strategically, because for one thing, I think that's way too much pressure to put on a person to change the world with one art project, right? You know, I mean, we look at it as we'll do our best to contribute as much as we can to the aggregate of action that's occurring over time. And maybe if we're lucky, that aggregate all together will make some kind of transformation or social change that is to the better. So we don't think a lot about endpoints, or especially like outcomes, and how are you going to measure that outcome? And we tend to very much back away from that. But we have the general idea within a given situation. This appears to be the most intense point of politics within this moment, within this place, and with these people that we're working on. And so let's work with that politics in this moment. Now we could jump to the next project the next day. Different politics. You can say, but that one contradicts that one. Don't care. What is functioning in the moment and making a practical difference? We're not looking at the long term so much and final outcomes.
We're slightly different.
Yeah.
We're a little specific. Our target is not the American Museum of Natural History. It's not even David Koch. It's capitalism.
Yeah.
And our interest is in creating universal egalitarian emancipation, period. It's as simple as that. Communism, if you like. So what that means is, like, I mean, David Koch, it's not our target. He's a foil. There was an article that came out after we published these things that said, is Koch money becoming radioactive? And so is the economics magazines. They get it. And they got the story. It's like, it's exactly what happened to Philip Morris. If you bring down, it's like, there's such an obvious contradiction in Koch being a sponsor of natural history museums that is an easy, low-hanging fruit that if like it's freaking, that's a difficult fruit to knock off the tree, but if you could hit that one, then it's like, you start to hit a domino effect then you can hit the other cultural institutions. They're gonna be a lot easier if you can hit the one that's the easiest to hit. And then, we're not just looking to knock it out of natural history museums, we're looking to think about, we're trying to occupy a natural history museum, imagining for what it should be, why people go there. When you go there with your kids, you're like, when you see nature there, you're not thinking, oh, this is about private water. You're thinking this is water that's everyone owns. This is water for the commons. That's what we're fighting for. That's what natural history museums are supposed to be fighting for.
All right, Jan, what are you fighting for?
I think, I sort of feel like I'm a civil servant, in this particular project. I really feel like, I'm a civil servant to the community, working to, get a little bit more of a cleanup. I mean, I go to the Superfund set meetings, and what's terrifying is you hear from the EPA that the bar of what's going to be cleaned up is unacceptable, And so, the idea is how do you work within the community, to raise that bar, just even a little bit, They keep telling us it's a marathon, not a sprint, and so the estimated cleanup is anywhere from 20 to 25 years down the line, and that's generation, So it's really to, like, if that's what's happening, is can they speed it up a little bit, and can they clean it up a little bit more,
right?
And that's.
Well, that leads me to an existential question for both of you guys. I get, like, my soul understands you, right? Because, like, Steve, because I feel like I can't hold a vision that long either, and not put my head in the oven.
Well, things change very
yeah.
But what's important to me about this, and what is difficult in terms of holding the vision, is I can't get behind something like universal emancipation. I don't know what that means. Mm-hmm. And when someone tries to describe it, it's kind of the left-wing side of, the right wing starts talking about freedom and God. And I don't get these concepts. And once you start unpacking them and trying to make them go into particular places, they completely unravel. They completely unravel. Or like a scientist asking what life is. There's something, we can't answer these questions. And it bothers me when we organize around something, or even like community. I hate that word. When we organize around something that probably doesn't exist. I don't know if that's the way to do it.
But I think that you guys are pretty sure that this does exist, this vision, and I understand what it
as a horizon.
Yeah, talk about that.
Well, one of the things we talked about with you earlier on was just the ideals of the institution.
Right.
I mean, the institution, like I was saying, the American Museum of Natural History, these museums have ideals that they purport to support, like
That's why the resources are being gathered around the museum in the first place.
Right.
Right.
So the question is between what is the ideal and what is the actual. There's a huge gap between those two things. So it's like, what it's gonna mean practically is, the thing is, right now everything's being subsumed into capital.
Right.
Into capitalism. So it's like you create these micro projects, golden, raising chickens, whatever it is. It's like it just gets reintegrated into the machine. It actually feeds the machine even faster. So the question is, so natural history museums, for example, become tools of capitalism to support public relations campaigns, so they can continue to fund misinformation and continue with the fossil fuel industry. So the question is, how could you take those institutions and redirect them so that they so you can occupy them as spaces that could actually fight for something else, fight for an end where nature is conceived of as a commons.
And that's something like that we've talked about. Museums offer, in particular natural history museums, offer perspectives.
Yeah.
And a perspective on nature is it one that understands it as something that we're all, that belongs to all of us for the common good for generations to come, or something that's to be privatized, chopped up, and sold off to the highest bidder? Because those are the two ideologies. Like that, there's an and that's the reason why we went after Koch, was because he represents an ideology that that's very much about the private versus the public.
Yeah.
So.
I don't know if this is a question or advice, actually, but from an institutional perspective, myself, I'm wondering if what you guys think, is there a possibility to create an institution that doesn't have a space between its ideals and its practice?
No.
No.
Jan? Well, then let's open it up.
That goes back to the subjectivity.
I'm done.
Any single thing, is not, there's no, there's no simple positive definition of a thing, right? It's split. It's defined as much by
Can you
that
get more
which is-
concrete than that? Because that's a really meta
that's where we're
idea.
getting into theory and
No,
stuff.
I know, but I'm a sculptor, so help me out.
I mean,
be really concrete with me.
I'm
about
also
that.
the activist, not the theorist in the
No,
collective,
totally.
so I'll probably
Yeah.
butcher it. But my understanding of this is that a thing is defined as much by that which it excludes as its positive attributes. And so it's like in a room, the negative space of the room is as much a part of it as the walls and the ceilings and the floors, right?
Yeah.
And in any particular subject, whether it's a person, an object, an institution, etc., right? It is defined as much by that negative space, by that thing that's missing, or that you can't put your finger on, or that it actively refuses or excludes, as by the stuff that you can all agree, yeah, that's a building with marble columns and and
Yeah.
this and taxidermy. And so for us, we are in any project looking for that exclusion and aiming to describe it.
I also have, I'll give a shot at this also. My answer would be, if a tree falls in a forest, how much is it worth? It's like, it doesn't matter if anybody sees it or not, it still has value. And the question is, to what end? What is that energy in that tree going to go towards? And that thing is perpetually going to be struggled over.
That's a good answer. I can't say anymore. Let's open it up to questions.
Yes.
Okay, my question's for Steve. You've actually answered a lot of my questions as you've been talking in the dialogue, but I guess the thing that I haven't heard about so far is how would you kind of compare and contrast your practice and what you do in either, obviously end result or no end result versus phenomenons like, viral things happening out in social media, Twitter shaming, things like that.
The answer that I would give to this is what we hope, because the one thing that we do also not pay much attention to is scale, in this particular sense, right? That for us, we can be small and small can be big, right? And that a very small gesture can possibly, it's the jackpot, you don't know if it's going to happen, but a very small gesture can set off a huge social revolution, whereas, something very big happens, it's spectacular, and it does nothing, right? So we think a great deal about the possibilities of molecular revolution, and I'll give you an example of what I mean, right? There was this moment in the 50s where there was this, both at the same time, a liberational and completely totalitarian thought of what if poor women could control their reproductive cycle. Think what that idea, the gesture of that ended with. With incredibly transformational, revolutionary moment. That's where that no one saw, no one really knew that's how it was going to go. It was, and so we do have hopes that there are gestures that will do that, but we're still not going to give up on a principle of indeterminacy. We're not going to say this is the probability that this is the one, the molecular revolution will finally happen. No, we don't do it. But yes, there can be these cascades of meaning and cascades of action that can at the least transform perhaps an institution, or in the greatest really transform society.
I applaud and admire all of you for what you're doing and trying to engage. In the spirit of critiquing capitalism and greenwashing, Becca, I'd like to appeal to you. You're doing an event critiquing Koch at the Smithsonian annual meeting with Joseph Romm. When Naomi Klein put out her comment in advance of her book that mainstream environmentalists were as bad as climate deniers before legitimizing a mainstream corporate-driven life, while acknowledging the reality of climate change, there was a lot of criticism she generated, including Joseph Romm, whose comments were at the deep bullying level. In the 90s, he was greenwashing Enron. Center for American Progress has been criticized for extensive corporate ties. In my view, was created to deflate real progressive voices and define progressivism in a way. So I'd like to appeal to you for those reasons. And also, they greenwashed very actively with Matt Damon and a couple other stars, biofuels, corn biofuels. They have Damon in a corn costume. And Romm has been part of that. And I'd like to appeal to you to find someone, other scientists in advance of that, to do your event, because to me, he embodies a really problematic aspect of the environmental centrist NGO world. And I compliment the criticism of the natural history museums, but at the same time, a lot of the environmental groups that are joining you, and I applaud you, I think great what you've been doing, but you come out of an environmental community that's not willing to do that to itself. Thank you.
The subject of this panel is sleeping with the enemy. I could kind of make a comment right there.
Would you be willing to articulate that I'm here embedded in Mr. Romm, but these are vast reasons?
The reason why Joe Romm is the speaker at a press conference when we're delivering, it's the Smithsonian's board meeting, June 15th, and we have 250,000 signatures. We're pushing 300,000 now that were gathered in just a few weeks, calling for the Smithsonian to kick Koch off the board. So we're going to deliver those petition signatures, and Romm is one of our speakers at the press conference because he has been the only person, let alone like climate scientist, to really deconstruct many times and raise a critique of the Koch-funded Hall of Human Origins at the Smithsonian, which is an exhibit on evolution, which doesn't, I would argue, need to address climate change, but it makes it its central thesis. When you walk in, there's a digital timeline of the history of the climate through the history of the planet. Because of the scale of the timeline, the contemporary moment looks almost like a flat line. And the main takeaway of the exhibit is the climate has always changed, and it's been an opportunity for us to evolve. And one of the last things in the exhibit is this bizarre, I was just talking to Mike from the Yes Men yesterday about this, and he's like, this sounds like something we would do. There's this interactive screen where it says, okay, imagine it's the future and the world is really, really hot. What does the future you look like? Are you tall and skinny like a giraffe? Or do you have many more sweat glands? And it's like two cartoon characters, like this skinny, lanky guy, and then this like short, squat guy sweating profusely. And then it says, touch to choose the one you want. It's like, there's, okay, but that's like my deconstruction of the exhibit. His deconstruction really gets into inaccuracies in the science, and some of the tactics of the fossil fuel lobby, etc. Why wouldn't I have this guy speak at the press conference? Come on.
Hi. Thanks. This has been very interesting. I've been thinking about sort of the role of humor and sort of the juvenile and getting people outside of their comfort zone, and also thinking about political cartoons, which used to have sort of a mass audience and a united audience. People from all different perspectives would look at them in the paper, and you could examine institutions and sort of have this seed of humor in it. Do you see your work at all as sort of an extension of the political cartoon in a world that's now very fragmented, where there aren't whole audiences or diverse groups that are necessarily looking at any one topic together or in the same, on the same platform or in the same way?
Hence tacticality, right? I mean, it means you can work with a specific moment, with the opportunities given in that specific moment. Because yeah, there is no overarching work. I think a long time ago we gave up the idea that we could do some kind of project, or artists could do some kind of project, or activists could do some kind of project that's going to speak to everybody. It's just never going to happen. And so to deal with it, how do we deal with the fragmentation? And how do we deal with the fact that certainly most of the political positions that we take, however temporarily, are minoritarian ones, right? The only way we've ever figured to do it is you have to be able to adapt very quickly and be ready to respond when opportunities come your way. So that's our answer to it. We don't try to.
Tracking people, scaring people, which is great. But how, no, it's great, but how do you find the idea of double agency, of building these relationships within these institutions? How do you find these people? Is it, do you go in a certain direction and then move to the left with your project? Or how, what do you do?
The one thing you're going to have, particularly if you're working with government agencies or with skittish sponsors, wherever they may come from, is you're going to have a lot of meetings, right? And in those meetings, you get to extract a lot of information of what people are like, and you can start to spot the folks that, you know what, that person might make a good producer. Let's get their card before we're out of this room, and then let's email them and set up a meeting just between us.
And you've never had funding, you've never been threatened with funding for what you're doing being taken away from you?
Yeah, lots of times. We've been threatened with funding being taken away. Okay. And that's when we lose, right? That's like when they go, like, that's it. We're walking on this. But, you know, we do pretty well.
Okay.
I want to address my question to Jan, or just sort of maybe say something and then ask a question. This is in response to the idea that we can't really accomplish anything big. I mean, it seems to me that, you know, we have a long history in the 20th century of trying to prove to corporations that they have done harm. And it's been a huge effort on the part of people with all kinds of cancers, or, you know, not just the contamination of land, but the people dying. And one corporation after another is always denying, oh, no. So, I mean, it seems like a very positive thing that, you know, Jan is able to get this corporation to at least admit that they are doing harm. You know, I mean, I feel like that's a very big step. That the fact that they're inviting you in, and I'm actually really curious how you did that. Like, how did you convince them to let you in?
Well, Jan didn't get them to just to clarify.
Yeah, just to clarify, the only thing ExxonMobil is doing in Newtown Creek is cleaning up. They're mandated by New York State and the federal government to do that. So
$20 million fine.
Well, that's not for the cleanup. That's just the retribution fine. So that's a settlement for kind of, you know, they really messed this up. So I mean, but at the same time, the community organization that I do work with were pivotal in, you know, in the settlement, in the, you know, in working toward, and that's not me, it's the, you know, organization. We're, you know, in making it a Superfund site, making it, you know, so, and through that organization, you know, that's how I was invited, and it was a lot of, you know, a lot of closed door meetings that people, you know, they had an interest in trying to reach out to the community, and the director knew that I was working on this project and sort of said, hey, how about this one, and they bought it, so it's, it was through just being embedded inside, I think.
Who's the organization?
Newtown Creek
Alliance.
I didn't catch your name, but would you talk more about the commons and classism? And actually, I think that the idea that we're fragmented and can never succeed is capitalism captured our brains. It occupies our brains. And I have a totally different project based in commons and the elimination of classism and race in this case. And it has captured people. There is no boundary. And it's captured the imagination. I'd like you to say more about your experience and talk more about that.
I absolutely agree. I think our imagination has been killed. Our political imagination, our sense of the possible and the impossible. Like that's the biggest travesty. And so I just want to push back a little bit on that and say that we were talking about this on the way over, that Margaret Mead quote, never doubt that a few committed individuals can change the world. In fact, it's the only thing that can. And she made that comment when she was collaborating with the CIA and and anthropologists were embedding in counterinsurgency campaigns, but to huge effect, right? And it was a small number of people that she was a part of, that she was one of them. And Naomi Oreskes, a historian of science, has written about how Climate Tonight. It's funny, we just promoted our Koch petition in advance of delivering the signatures in 2 weeks, and we're getting like 10. Climate denialist, climate denier or / Tea Party, etc. comments like an hour in response on our Facebook posts. And and after going public with this scientist letter, a number of our scientists got served with Oprah requests, which are like FOIA requests at public universities to turn over all emails with Koch in the subject or body. I feel like, one, that's an indication of striking a nerve, but two, that work went public 2 months ago, and within that time, and we're a small collective, right, we were featured in TrendWatch 2015, the museum sector's most read annual publication. We have been incorporated, our project has been incorporated into the core curriculum of several museum studies programs around the country. We built an email list of upwards of 70,000 supporters in 2 months, a network of 140 now prominent scientists, including several Nobel laureates, and current senior government officials who are scientists, garnered 100+ media hits, have been invited to exhibit at the Association of Science and Technology Center's annual convention in the fall, and are being given the single largest exhibitor spot by a factor of 5, to organize a divestment panel at the International Council of Museums convention in the fall as well, to guest edit issue of a series of articles in Museum Magazine about the issues we're raising, and being contacted by a number of whistleblowers or allies within the museum sector who have begun to catalog examples of self-censorship and just really want to help out. That all happened in the last 2 months. I just push back on the idea that we can't accomplish big things. This is just the beginning, and it's only when we believe in it, and we imagine it, and we strive to reach that horizon that will always be out of touch, but it's a lifelong, multi-generational, it's the human condition, right? It's like Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome. If we're the last few people on the planet, whose side are you fighting for?
My answer, quick answer to that.
Yeah.
It's just, I I mean, the reason why David Koch is interested in natural history museums, or why any fossil fuel producer is interested in natural history museums, is because they have a lot of authority. They represent a kind of knowledge that's associated with science that people have a lot of trust in. And it's largely to do with aesthetics. When we went to the American Alliance of Museums annual conference, we sat down with a bunch of these, curators and people from these museums, and they're like, "Where did you guys come from?" We were like, 5 years ago, we pretended we were architects, and we got invited to panels as architects. Now we're pretending we're a natural history museum. We'll admit this to you now. I mean, it's like, it doesn't take that much, actually.
Yeah.
Exactly.
But the thing is, if we were dressing up, if we were artists and we're speaking as individuals, we wouldn't hold that authority. And in this case, we were occupying this institution that has all this power. And by occupying that name, the Natural History Museum, that's absurd. We command that control. We steal a bit of that control, and it's something that's recognizable. It's not a new thing. People recognize it, and they're like, "Well, those people must know something." we just have a costume, basically. An email list and a costume. That's all we are.
Thank you.
All right, I think that's the perfect place to end it. Actually, email list in a costume. I want to thank Donald and Shelley for providing a great venue for tonight. I want to thank you guys. Amazing conversation. Thank you so much. I want to thank you all for coming out. Like us on Facebook and tweet us on the Twitter so that you can hear more about what we are doing. Pick up great postcards, join our mailing list. We are always here to talk about socially engaged art. Thank you.